The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle like a protective shroud. But inside the ancient walls, tension crackled through the air with an intensity that made even the most seasoned staff members uneasy. Detective Chief Inspector Marcus Wellington had served the Royal Protection Unit for 15 years, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. As he stood in the marble corridor outside the Queen Consort's private office, his weathered hands gripped a sealed envelope that could potentially shake the very foundations of the monarchy. The envelope contained authorization papers signed by Queen Consort Camilla herself, demanding unprecedented access to the Princess of Wales's private quarters, personal correspondence, and daily schedule. The request was cloaked in official language about security assessments and routine protocol reviews. But Wellington's instincts told him something far more sinister was at play. He had noticed the subtle changes in palace dynamics over the past several months, the way certain staff members whispered in corners, and how the Queen Consort's advisors had been making unusual inquiries about Kate's activities. Wellington's radio crackled to life, interrupting his troubled thoughts. "Sir, the princess has returned from her morning engagement at the Children's Hospital," came the voice of Sergeant Emma Clark, one of his most trusted team members. "She's requesting a private meeting with you in the blue drawing room." The detective's jaw tightened. Kate had been unusually alert to potential threats lately, and her request for a private meeting suggested she had noticed something troubling as well. As Wellington made his way through the labyrinthine corridors of the castle, he reflected on his years of service. He had protected 3 generations of royals, weathered scandals, terrorist threats, and media frenzies. But this felt different. This felt personal, calculated, and deeply wrong. The monarchy had survived countless challenges throughout history, but internal betrayals were often the most destructive. He had sworn an oath to protect all members of the royal family. But what happened when that oath put him in direct conflict with orders from within the family itself? The blue drawing room was bathed in soft afternoon light when Wellington entered. Princess Kate stood by the tall windows overlooking the east terrace, her elegant figure silhouetted against the golden rays. She turned as he approached, and he immediately noticed the worry lines that had appeared around her eyes over the past few weeks. Despite the pressures of royal life, Kate had always maintained a composure that impressed even the most cynical protection officers, but today something had clearly shaken her usual calm demeanor. "Marcus," she began, using the informal address that had developed over years of working together, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She moved away from the window, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "Have there been any unusual security protocols implemented recently?"
ASSTANMAP.
"Any new surveillance measures or changes to my protection detail that weren't discussed with me directly?" Wellington felt the weight of the envelope in his jacket pocket, like a burning coal. He had always prided himself on his honesty and direct communication with those under his protection, but this situation demanded careful navigation. "Ma'am, there have been some administrative requests that have come through official channels," he replied carefully. "However, I have concerns about the nature and timing of these requests that I believe warrant your attention." Kate's expression sharpened. She had developed an acute sensitivity to the political undercurrents of palace life, particularly since her marriage had elevated her to one of the most visible positions in the royal family. "What kind of requests, Marcus? I need to know exactly what we're dealing with here." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to navigate treacherous royal waters while maintaining her dignity and principles. The detective chief inspector made a decision that would alter the course of events for everyone involved. He withdrew the sealed envelope from his jacket and placed it on the polished mahogany table between them. "These are authorization papers requesting comprehensive access to your private spaces and communications," he said quietly. "The official justification is security assessment, but the scope and secrecy of the request suggests other motives." Kate's face went pale as she examined the documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she read through the detailed specifications of what was being requested. The papers authorized not just physical searches, but access to her private correspondence, her children's schedules, and even monitoring of her personal phone calls. It was an invasion of privacy that went far beyond any legitimate security concern, and the fact that it had been initiated without her knowledge or consent made it feel like a betrayal of the most fundamental kind. "This is signed by Camilla," Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How is this even legal? How can she authorize surveillance of another member of the royal family without proper oversight? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Wellington could see the wheels of Kate's sharp mind working through the implications of what she was reading. Wellington had anticipated this reaction. Technically, the Queen Consort has broad authority over security protocols within the royal household, he explained. However, the implementation of such measures typically requires consultation with the affected parties and approval from multiple levels of the security apparatus. These papers appear to have bypassed several standard procedures. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Ma'am, in my professional opinion, this appears to be an abuse of administrative authority rather than a legitimate security measure. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Kate moved to one of the burgundy leather chairs and sat down heavily, the weight of the situation clearly affecting her. She had faced many challenges since joining the royal family, from intense media scrutiny to complex family dynamics, but this felt like a new level of threat. It wasn't coming from outside forces or tabloid newspapers, but from within the very institution she had sworn to serve and protect. What are my options here, Marcus? She asked, looking up at the man who had become not just her protector, but one of her most trusted advisors. If I refuse to comply with these orders, what are the consequences? And if I do comply, what precedent does that set for future invasions of privacy? Her questions revealed the depth of her understanding of the broader implications of this situation. Wellington had been considering the same questions since receiving the authorization papers. Ma'am, as your protection officer, my primary responsibility is your safety and security, he said firmly. If I believe that implementing these measures would compromise your well-being or place you at risk, I have not only the right but the obligation to refuse compliance. He moved closer to where she sat, his voice taking on a tone of absolute conviction. In my professional assessment, this unauthorized surveillance operation poses a significant threat to your personal security and could be used for purposes that have nothing to do with your protection. Kate felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had hoped that Wellington's integrity and professionalism would guide him to the right decision, but she understood the difficult position this placed him in. Refusing direct orders from the Queen Consort could end his career and potentially expose him to serious legal consequences. The fact that he was willing to take such risks to protect her privacy and safety spoke volumes about his character and commitment to his oath as a protection officer. There's something else you need to know, Kate said, making her own difficult decision to trust Wellington completely. Over the past few months, I've noticed unusual interest in my schedule from people who shouldn't have access to that information. Private meetings I've attended have somehow become topics of conversation among people who weren't present. Personal conversations I've had have been referenced in ways that suggest someone has been monitoring my communications. She paused, gathering her courage to voice her suspicions. I believe this formal authorization is just the tip of something much larger that's already been happening. Wellington's expression darkened. If Kate's suspicions were correct, then the authorization papers represented an attempt to legitimize surveillance that had already been taking place illegally. This would constitute a serious breach of security protocols and potentially criminal activity. Ma'am, if unauthorized surveillance has been occurring, we need to conduct a comprehensive security review immediately, he said. This goes beyond privacy concerns and enters the realm of potential criminal activity. The afternoon sun had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the elegant drawing room as Kate and Wellington continued their conversation. They both understood that they were standing at a crossroads that would define not only their own futures, but potentially the future of the royal institution itself. The decisions they made in the coming hours and days would determine whether the monarchy could maintain the trust and integrity that formed the foundation of its authority. I need to ask you directly, Marcus, Kate said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Will you help me resist this invasion of privacy? Will you stand with me even if it means defying direct orders from the Queen Consort? The question hung between them like a challenge, but also like a plea from someone who had found herself in an impossible situation. Wellington didn't hesitate. Ma'am, I took an oath to protect all members of the royal family from threats both external and internal, he said with quiet determination. That oath doesn't come with exceptions or political considerations. If protecting you requires me to refuse orders that I believe are improper or potentially harmful, then that's exactly what I'll do. His words carried the weight of years of service and an unshakable moral compass that had guided him through countless difficult situations. As evening approached, Kate and Wellington began planning their response to what they both now recognized as a serious threat to the integrity of the royal household. They would need to gather evidence, build alliances among trustworthy staff members, and find ways to protect Kate's privacy without triggering a destructive confrontation that could damage the monarchy itself. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but they both understood that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Kate and Wellington developing strategies for identifying the source of the unauthorized surveillance and building a case for why the formal authorization should be rejected. They discussed potential allies within the palace staff, legal resources that might be available to them, and ways to document any evidence of ongoing surveillance activities. Every decision they made had to balance Kate's need for protection with the broader stability of the royal institution. As the castle settled into its nightly routine, Kate and Wellington knew that their conversation had set in motion a series of events that would test the very foundations of loyalty, duty, and justice within the royal household. They had chosen to stand together against what they saw as an abuse of power, but they also understood that their decision would likely trigger a response from those who had initiated the surveillance in the first place. The game of royal politics was about to become far more dangerous and personal than either of them had anticipated. The night air carried a chill that seemed to penetrate even the thick walls of Windsor Castle. And as Kate finally retired to her private quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that invisible eyes were watching her every move. The authorization papers might have been the first official acknowledgement of the surveillance, but her instincts told her that the real investigation had been going on for much longer than anyone was willing to admit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she felt the comfort of knowing that she had at least one ally who was willing to put principle above politics in the dangerous game that royal life had become. The first light of dawn barely filtered through the heavy curtains of Windsor Castle when Detective Chief Inspector Wellington received an urgent summons to report immediately to the Queen Consort's private office. The message, delivered by a stone-faced aide, made it clear that his refusal to implement the surveillance authorization had not gone unnoticed. As he walked through the corridors that had become as familiar as his own home over the years, Wellington could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him. These same hallways had witnessed the rise and fall of monarchs, the birth of scandals, and the quiet machinations that kept the royal machine functioning despite its human flaws. The Queen Consort's office was a study in calculated intimidation. Rich burgundy walls lined with portraits of previous queens created an atmosphere of royal authority, while the massive oak desk positioned near the center of the room served as a throne from which Camilla could hold court. She was already seated when Wellington entered, her fingers drumming impatiently on a stack of papers that he suspected contained his personnel file and possibly formal charges for insubordination. "Chief Inspector Wellington," Camilla began without preamble, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had learned to wield power effectively. "I trust you understand why you're here." She gestured toward the chair positioned directly across from her desk, but Wellington noticed that it had been positioned lower than her own seat, a subtle but deliberate psychological tactic designed to establish dominance in the conversation. Wellington remained standing, a decision that immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. "Your Majesty, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the security protocols you've requested," he said calmly. "My assessment indicates that the proposed surveillance measures present significant risks to the Princess of Wales's personal security and could potentially compromise the overall safety of the royal family." His words were carefully chosen to frame his refusal in terms of professional judgment rather than personal defiance. Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained controlled. "Chief Inspector, I appreciate your dedication to security concerns, but I think you may have forgotten your place in the hierarchy of this institution," she replied. "The authorization I provided was not a request or a suggestion. It was a direct order from the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom." She leaned forward slightly, emphasizing each word. "Your job is to implement security measures, not to question the judgment of your superiors." The tension in the room was palpable as Wellington considered his response. He had anticipated this confrontation, but the reality of facing down the second most powerful person in the royal hierarchy was more challenging than he had expected. Your Majesty, with respect, my oath as a protection officer requires me to prioritize the safety and well-being of those under my protection above all other considerations, he said firmly. If I believe that implementing certain measures would compromise that safety, I have both the authority and the obligation to refuse compliance. Camilla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the room. Are you seriously suggesting that I, the Queen Consort, would authorize measures that would harm a member of this family? She demanded. The Princess of Wales is under suspicion of activities that could potentially damage the reputation and stability of the monarchy. This investigation is necessary to protect not just the institution, but Kate herself from the consequences of her poor judgment. Wellington felt a chill run down his spine at the word suspicion. This was the first time anyone had explicitly suggested that Kate was under investigation for wrongdoing rather than simply being subjected to routine security reviews. Your Majesty, what specific activities are causing concern? He asked, his professional instincts taking over. If there are legitimate security threats or concerns about the princess's conduct, those should be addressed through proper channels, with full transparency and due process. For a moment, Camilla hesitated, and Wellington caught a glimpse of something that might have been uncertainty or guilt crossing her features. But it was quickly replaced by the mask of royal authority that she had learned to wear so effectively. The specific details of the investigation are classified at the highest levels, she said curtly. Your role is to facilitate the collection of information, not to question the necessity or validity of the investigation itself. Wellington realized that he was being asked to participate in what amounted to a fishing expedition, surveillance without specific justification or evidence of wrongdoing. This violated every principle of professional law enforcement and security work that he had learned during his career. Your Majesty, I cannot in good conscience implement surveillance measures without understanding the specific threats or concerns they are designed to address, he said. This is not a matter of questioning your authority, but of fulfilling my professional responsibilities. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, followed by the entrance of Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the Queen Consort's private secretary, and one of the most influential figures in the palace hierarchy. Hartwell was a man who had built his career on navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics, and his presence in the room immediately elevated the stakes of the confrontation. Wellington knew that Hartwell's involvement meant that this issue had implications far beyond a simple disagreement about security protocols. Your Majesty, Hartwell said with a deferential bow, I apologize for the interruption, but there are some urgent matters that require your immediate attention. He placed a folder on Camilla's desk, but not before shooting a meaningful glance at Wellington that suggested the detective's presence was no longer welcome in the room. Camilla picked up the folder and quickly scanned its contents, her expression growing increasingly stern. Chief Inspector Wellington, she said without looking up, you are hereby relieved of your duties as primary protection officer for the Princess of Wales, effective immediately. Inspector Defies will assume those responsibilities until this matter is resolved. She finally raised her eyes to meet his gaze. You are also suspended from active duty pending a formal review of your conduct and fitness for service. Wellington had expected this outcome, but the reality of losing his position still hit him like a physical blow. For 15 years, protecting the royal family had been not just his job, but his calling, his purpose, and his identity. The thought of being forced to stand aside while others potentially placed Kate in danger was almost unbearable. Your Majesty, I must respectfully protest this decision, he said. My conduct has been guided entirely by my professional judgment and my oath to protect all members of the royal family. Your oath, Camilla repeated, her voice taking on a dangerous edge, is to serve the crown and follow the lawful orders of your superiors. You have failed in both of those fundamental responsibilities. She returned the folder to Hartwell and stood again, clearly indicating that the meeting was over. Security will escort you from the premises. You are not to have any contact with the Princess of Wales or any other member of the royal family until this matter is resolved. As Wellington was led from the Queen Consort's office, his mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. His suspension effectively removed the primary obstacle to implementing the surveillance measures against Kate. But it also meant that she was now more vulnerable than ever. Inspector Davies was competent but inexperienced with the complex political dynamics of the royal household, and Wellington feared that he might be more susceptible to pressure from those pushing for the investigation. The walk through the castle corridors toward the exit felt like a march of defeat, but Wellington's determination to protect Kate had not wavered despite his official removal from duty. He understood that his suspension was designed to isolate Kate from potential allies and make her more vulnerable to whatever investigation was being planned. The fact that Camilla had been unable or unwilling to provide specific justification for the surveillance suggested that the real motives were political rather than security-related. As he reached the main entrance of the castle, Wellington's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The Rose Garden at Frogmore. 1 hour. Come alone. He recognized the reference immediately. The Rose Garden at Frogmore House had been a favorite retreat for Kate during times of stress, and the coded message could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of her habits and preferences. Despite the risk of violating his suspension orders, Wellington knew he had to respond to what might be his only opportunity to ensure Kate's continued safety. The drive to Frogmore House gave Wellington time to process the full implications of his confrontation with the Queen Consort. The speed with which his suspension had been implemented, and the presence of Sir Geoffrey Hartwell during the meeting, suggested that this entire situation had been carefully planned in advance. His refusal to implement the surveillance had been anticipated, and his removal had been prepared as the next step in whatever operation was being conducted against Kate. The Rose Garden at Frogmore was one of the most secluded and beautiful spots on the royal estate, surrounded by high hedges that provided both privacy and security. As Wellington approached the designated meeting location, he spotted a solitary figure seated on the stone bench near the center of the garden. Even from a distance, he recognized Princess Kate's distinctive silhouette, but he was surprised by her choice to meet him in person, given the risks involved. "I heard about your suspension," Kate said softly as Wellington approached. Geoffrey Hartwell made sure the news spread quickly through the staff. "I think it was meant to send a message about what happens to people who don't follow orders." Her voice carried a mixture of gratitude and guilt, as if she blamed herself for the consequences Wellington was facing because of his decision to protect her. Wellington sat down beside her on the bench, maintaining the informal but respectful relationship they had developed over the years. "Ma'am, my decision to refuse those orders was based on my professional judgment and my commitment to your safety," he said firmly. "I don't regret that decision, and I would make it again under the same circumstances." He paused, looking around the garden to ensure they were truly alone. "However, my suspension means that you're now more vulnerable than ever to whatever investigation they're planning." Kate had clearly been thinking about the same concerns. "Marcus, I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned yesterday," she said hesitantly. "Over the past few weeks, I've been approached by several members of the press who claim to have received anonymous tips about my activities. They've asked questions about private meetings I've attended, charity work I've been involved in, and even personal conversations I've had with family members." She turned to face him directly. "Someone has been feeding information to the media, and now I understand that it's probably coming from the same source that's pushing for this formal surveillance." Wellington felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The unauthorized surveillance that Kate had suspected was real, and it was being used not just to gather information, but to actively damage her reputation through strategic leaks to the press. This suggested a coordinated campaign designed to undermine Kate's position within the royal family, possibly as a prelude to more serious consequences. "Ma'am, this has moved far beyond simple privacy violations," he said grimly. "If information about your activities is being selectively leaked to the media, that constitutes a deliberate attempt to damage your reputation and your standing within the royal family." The implications of Wellington's assessment were deeply troubling for both of them. Kate understood that her position within the royal hierarchy was more fragile than many people realized, and that a sustained campaign of negative publicity could seriously damage her ability to fulfill her royal duties effectively. The monarchy depended on public trust and respect, and if that trust could be undermined through carefully orchestrated leaks and investigations, even false allegations could have devastating consequences. "What can we do?" Kate asked, her voice reflecting both determination and uncertainty. "You've been suspended, which means you can't provide official protection anymore." I don't know who else in the palace I can trust with this information, and I can't go public with allegations against the queen consort without solid evidence." She stood and walked toward the edge of the garden, where the afternoon sun created dancing patterns through the hedge leaves. "I feel like I'm being backed into a corner with fewer options every day." Wellington had been considering the same problem since his suspension that morning. "Ma'am, while I can no longer provide official protection, my suspension doesn't prevent me from conducting an independent investigation into what's been happening," he said. "I have contacts throughout the security services and law enforcement who could help us gather evidence about the unauthorized surveillance and the source of the media leaks." He joined her near the hedge, lowering his voice even further. "However, this would have to be done completely outside official channels, which means taking significant personal and legal risks." Kate turned back toward him, her expression reflecting both hope and apprehension. "Are you willing to take those risks? I can't ask you to jeopardize your career and possibly your freedom for my sake, especially when you've already sacrificed so much by refusing to follow orders." Her concern for his well-being was genuine, but Wellington could also see the desperate need for help in her eyes. "Ma'am, protecting you and upholding the principles I've sworn to defend is exactly what my career has been about," Wellington replied without hesitation. "If I can't do that through official channels, then I'll find other ways to fulfill those responsibilities." He looked around the peaceful garden, knowing that this might be one of their last opportunities for private conversation. "The question is whether you're prepared for what this investigation might uncover, and whether you're willing to act on that information even if it leads to serious confrontations within the royal family." The weight of that question settled over both of them as they stood in the fading afternoon light. They both understood that pursuing this investigation could lead to revelations that might shake the very foundations of the royal institution. But they also recognized that allowing the surveillance and character assassination to continue unchecked could be even more damaging in the long run. The choices they made in the coming days would determine not just Kate's future, but the future integrity and trustworthiness of the monarchy itself. As they prepared to leave the garden separately to avoid attracting attention, Kate and Wellington finalized their plans for maintaining contact and beginning their unofficial investigation. They would need to be extremely careful about communication methods and meeting arrangements, as both of them were likely now under closer scrutiny than ever before. The stakes had been raised significantly by Wellington's suspension, but their commitment to uncovering the truth and protecting Kate's integrity had only grown stronger in response to the increased pressure they were facing. 3 days after Wellington's suspension, the atmosphere at Windsor Castle had become noticeably more oppressive, with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone from senior staff members to the youngest pages. Inspector Defies had assumed Wellington's duties with obvious reluctance, and his discomfort with the political complexities of his new position was evident to anyone who spent time around the Princess of Wales' security detail. Kate noticed that her new protection officer avoided eye contact and seemed to be reporting her activities to his superiors with unusual frequency and detail. The implementation of the surveillance authorization had begun immediately following Wellington's removal, though it was being carried out with a level of subtlety that suggested those responsible understood the sensitive nature of their activities. Kate had identified at least 3 new staff members who had appeared in areas where they had no legitimate business, and her private secretary had mentioned receiving unusual requests for information about her schedule and personal appointments. The investigation that Camilla had authorized was clearly moving forward rapidly, despite the lack of any apparent justification for such intrusive measures. Wellington had not remained idle during his forced absence from the castle. Drawing upon contacts developed during his 15-year career in royal protection, he had begun conducting a careful investigation into the sources and scope of the unauthorized surveillance that had been targeting Kate. His inquiries had revealed a disturbing pattern of activity that extended far beyond anything that could be justified by legitimate security concerns. The operation appeared to involve multiple departments within the royal household, as well as external contractors whose involvement raised serious questions about information security and potential security breaches. The breakthrough in Wellington's investigation came from an unexpected source. Elena Rodriguez, a telecommunications technician who had been contracted to upgrade the communication systems in several royal residences. Elena had noticed unusual equipment installations and network modifications that didn't match the specifications in her work orders, and her professional curiosity had led her to document the discrepancies. When she realized that these unauthorized modifications appeared to be surveillance equipment, she had reached out to Wellington through a mutual contact in the security services. Elena's evidence was both compelling and deeply troubling. The surveillance equipment that had been installed was far more sophisticated than anything required for routine security monitoring, and it was specifically configured to capture and record private communications, including encrypted phone calls and internet traffic. The timing of these installations corresponded exactly with the period when Kate had first noticed unusual interest in her activities, confirming that the formal authorization Wellington had been asked to implement was indeed designed to legitimize surveillance that had already been taking place illegally. Wellington arranged to meet Elena at a small cafe in Windsor Town, far from the castle and any potential surveillance. The choice of location was deliberate, as both of them understood that their conversation could have serious consequences if it were discovered by those responsible for the unauthorized surveillance operation. Elena arrived carrying a laptop bag containing copies of the documentation she had gathered, including photographs of the surveillance equipment and detailed technical specifications that would be crucial evidence if the matter ever reached formal investigation or legal proceedings. "The equipment I photographed is military-grade surveillance technology," Elena explained as she spread printouts across their corner table. "This isn't the kind of thing you install for routine security monitoring, or even for protecting against external threats. This equipment is designed for comprehensive intelligence gathering on specific targets." She pointed to one of the technical diagrams. "Look at these specifications. This system can intercept and decode encrypted communications, track internet usage patterns, and even monitor conversations in supposedly private spaces through advanced acoustic analysis." Wellington studied the evidence with growing alarm. The scope and sophistication of the surveillance equipment far exceeded anything that could be justified for protecting Kate's security. Instead, it appeared to be designed for the kind of comprehensive intelligence gathering typically used against foreign agents or suspected criminals. The fact that such equipment had been installed without proper authorization and targeted against a member of the royal family represented a serious breach of both legal protocols and ethical standards. "Elena, do you have any information about who authorized these installations?" Wellington asked. "The equipment you're describing would require significant financial resources and high-level approval to acquire and deploy. This isn't something that could be done by a single individual or even a small group without substantial institutional support." His questions reflected his growing understanding that the surveillance operation represented a much larger conspiracy than he had initially suspected. Elena nodded grimly. "The work orders I received were signed by Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, but they were supposedly part of a routine security upgrade project," she explained. "However, when I started documenting the discrepancies between what was ordered and what was actually being installed, I discovered that there were multiple layers of authorization involved. Some of the equipment was being funded through budgets that aren't normally used for security purposes, and some of the technical specifications required clearances that go far beyond what would be needed for protecting royal residences. The implications of Elena's discoveries were staggering. The surveillance operation was not only unauthorized and potentially illegal, but it was also being funded and supported through official channels in ways that suggested corruption at multiple levels of the royal administration. The involvement of Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, one of the most powerful figures in the palace hierarchy, indicated that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the royal household. Wellington realized that Kate was facing a threat far more serious and organized than either of them had initially understood. Wellington's phone buzzed with an urgent text message from Kate. "Need to meet immediately. Something has happened." The message was followed by coordinates that indicated a location in the private gardens of Kensington Palace, a spot that Kate often used for confidential conversations because of its isolation and natural acoustics that would make electronic surveillance more difficult. Wellington quickly gathered Elena's evidence and prepared to leave the cafe, knowing that Kate would not have requested an emergency meeting unless something significant had occurred. The drive to Kensington Palace gave Wellington time to consider how to share Elena's findings with Kate, and what their next steps should be. The evidence Elena had gathered was substantial enough to support serious allegations of unauthorized surveillance and potential criminal activity. But using it would require revealing Elena's involvement and potentially exposing her to retaliation from those responsible for the surveillance operation. Wellington also knew that Kate would need to make some difficult decisions about how to respond to what they had discovered. Kate was waiting in the secluded garden pavilion when Wellington arrived, her usually composed demeanor clearly shaken by whatever had prompted her urgent message. She was accompanied by her private secretary, James Morrison, whose presence indicated that the situation had escalated beyond matters that Kate felt comfortable handling alone. Morrison was one of the few staff members whom Kate trusted completely, and his inclusion in the meeting suggested that she had decided to expand their circle of trusted allies in response to the growing threat they faced. "Marcus, something extraordinary has happened," Kate began without preamble. "This morning I received a visit from Amanda Thornfield, who claims to be a journalist investigating corruption within the royal household." Kate's voice carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she continued. "She presented me with documentation that appears to show financial irregularities and unauthorized activities that she claims are connected to the surveillance operation we've been investigating." Wellington felt his heart rate accelerate as he processed this information. The appearance of a journalist with evidence related to their investigation could be either a breakthrough or a trap, depending on Amanda Thornfield's true motivations and the source of her information. "Ma'am, did she indicate how she obtained this documentation or what her intentions are regarding publication?" he asked. "The timing of her approach, given everything that's been happening, seems extremely convenient or extremely suspicious." Kate exchanged a glance with James Morrison before responding. "That's exactly what we were thinking," she said. "Amanda claims that she's been investigating irregularities in royal household finances for several months, and that her investigation led her to discover evidence of the surveillance operation against me." Kate paused, clearly struggling with the decision of whether to trust this unexpected source of information. "However, she's demanding an exclusive interview in exchange for sharing her evidence, and she's indicated that she plans to publish her story whether I cooperate or not." The appearance of Amanda Thornfield represented a new and potentially dangerous development in an already complex situation. Wellington understood that journalists could be valuable allies in exposing corruption and abuse of power, but they could also be manipulated by those seeking to control the narrative or damage reputations through strategic leaks of selective information. The fact that Thornfield had specifically approached Kate suggested either genuine concern for exposing the truth or a more sinister attempt to force Kate into a position where she would be compelled to make damaging admissions or accusations. "Ma'am, I think we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed with this journalist," Wellington advised. "The evidence I've been gathering independently suggests that the surveillance operation is much more extensive and better organized than we initially suspected." He briefly described Elena's findings about the sophisticated surveillance equipment and the high-level authorization that had been required for its installation. "If Amanda Thornfield has additional evidence about financial irregularities, that could be crucial for understanding the full scope of what we're dealing with." James Morrison, who had been listening intently to the conversation, finally spoke up. "Your Royal Highness, I think we need to consider the possibility that Amanda Thornfield's approach is connected to the same people who are behind the surveillance operation," he said carefully. "If they're planning to publish damaging stories about you regardless of your cooperation, this could be an attempt to control the narrative by forcing you to respond to their allegations on their terms rather than yours." Kate had clearly been thinking along similar lines. "That's why I wanted to meet with both of you before making any decisions about how to respond to her," she explained. "If we're going to expose this surveillance operation and the people behind it, we need to do it in a way that protects the integrity of the monarchy while ensuring that justice is served." She looked directly at Wellington. "Marcus, given what you've discovered about the scope of this operation, do you think we have enough evidence to take this to law enforcement authorities?" Wellington had been considering the same question since reviewing Elena's documentation. "Ma'am, the evidence Elena has gathered, combined with what we know about the unauthorized surveillance and the media leaks, would certainly justify a formal investigation," he said. "However, taking this to law enforcement would necessarily involve exposing the details publicly, which could be damaging to the monarchy even if you're ultimately vindicated. He paused to consider the political implications of their options. The alternative would be to present the evidence to someone within the royal hierarchy who has the authority to address the situation internally. But that would require finding someone we can trust who also has sufficient power to take action against those responsible. The complexity of their situation was becoming more apparent with each new piece of information they gathered. Kate was caught between the need to protect herself from an increasingly sophisticated surveillance and character assassination campaign, and the need to avoid actions that could damage the monarchy itself. The institution that she had sworn to serve was being used as a weapon against her, but exposing that fact publicly could undermine the very foundation of royal authority and public trust that made the monarchy viable. "There's something else we need to consider," Kate said quietly. "William has been asking questions about the changes in my security arrangements and the unusual activity around the palace. I haven't told him everything we've discovered, but I can't continue to keep him in the dark much longer." The mention of Prince William added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. As Kate's husband and second in line to the throne, William had both the right to know what was happening and the power to potentially intervene on Kate's behalf. Wellington understood the delicate balance Kate was trying to maintain. Prince William's involvement would certainly strengthen her position and provide powerful protection against further surveillance and harassment, but it would also escalate the situation to a level where quiet resolution might become impossible. A direct confrontation between Prince William and the Queen Consort over the treatment of his wife would have implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation, potentially affecting the line of succession and the future stability of the monarchy. "Ma'am, I think the decision about involving Prince William depends largely on what Amanda Thornfield decides to publish and how quickly," Wellington said. "If she's planning to go public with allegations against you, then having Prince William's support would be crucial for protecting your position and maintaining public confidence." He looked around the garden pavilion, acutely aware that even this supposedly private space might be under surveillance. "However, if we can resolve this situation quietly through other means, it might be better to limit the number of people who know the full extent of what's been happening." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden, Kate, Wellington, and Morrison continued their discussion of the impossible choices they faced. Each potential course of action carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes, and the pressure of time was increasing as Amanda Thornfield's deadline for a decision approached. The evidence they had gathered painted a picture of a sophisticated and well-resourced conspiracy against Kate, but proving that conspiracy and bringing its perpetrators to justice would require careful planning and considerable courage from everyone involved. The meeting concluded with an agreement to gather additional evidence before making final decisions about how to proceed. Wellington would continue working with Elena to document the full scope of the surveillance operation, while Kate would carefully consider how much to reveal to Prince William and how to respond to Amanda Thornfield's demands. They all understood that the choices they made in the coming days would determine not only Kate's future, but the future integrity and trustworthiness of the monarchy itself. The confrontation that everyone had been dreading finally erupted on a gray October morning when Prince William unexpectedly returned early from a scheduled engagement in Scotland. He had received a cryptic phone call from James Morrison, hinting at serious concerns about Kate's security situation, and his decision to cut short his royal duties and return immediately to London indicated the gravity of what he had been told. As William's helicopter touched down on the grounds of Kensington Palace, Kate knew that the careful balance she had been trying to maintain between protecting the monarchy and protecting herself was about to shift dramatically. William found Kate in the morning room where she often took her breakfast, surrounded by newspapers that contained increasingly hostile coverage of her recent public appearances. The stories were subtle but persistent, questioning her judgment, her commitment to royal duties, and even her suitability for her role as future queen. The pattern of negative coverage had intensified over the past week, and Kate understood that it was being orchestrated by the same people behind the surveillance operation. Someone was using the information gathered through unauthorized monitoring to craft a media campaign designed to undermine her position within the royal family. "Kate, we need to talk," William said without preamble, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled anger that Kate had rarely heard during their years together. "James Morrison called me yesterday with concerns about your security arrangements, and when I tried to get details from the Royal Protection Command, I was told that the information was classified and that I would need special authorization to access it. He moved to close the door of the morning room, ensuring their conversation would remain private. Since when do I need authorization to know about threats to my wife's safety? Kate had been preparing for this conversation, but the reality of finally sharing the full truth with William was more difficult than she had anticipated. She gestured for him to sit beside her at the small table where she had been trying unsuccessfully to eat breakfast while reading the troubling newspaper coverage. "William, there are things happening that go far beyond normal security concerns," she began carefully. "I've been trying to handle the situation quietly to avoid creating problems for the family, but I think we've reached a point where that's no longer possible." Over the next hour, Kate explained everything she and Wellington had discovered about the unauthorized surveillance, the suspicious media leaks, and the systematic campaign that appeared to be designed to damage her reputation and potentially force her out of her royal role. She showed William the evidence Elena had gathered about the surveillance equipment, shared the suspicious authorization papers that Wellington had refused to implement, and described the pattern of hostile media coverage that had intensified in recent weeks. With each new piece of information, William's expression grew darker and his anger more focused. "This is absolutely unacceptable," William said when Kate had finished her explanation. His voice was quiet but carried an intensity that made it clear he was struggling to contain his rage. "If what you're telling me is accurate, then members of our own household have been conducting an unauthorized intelligence operation against you, and using that information to damage your reputation through strategic media leaks." He stood and began pacing across the small room, his hands clenched into fists. "This isn't just an attack on you, Kate. This is an attack on the integrity of the monarchy itself." Kate felt both relief and apprehension at William's reaction. His support and validation were exactly what she had hoped for, but she also knew that his involvement would escalate the situation beyond anything they had yet experienced. Prince William had the authority and the platform to demand answers and accountability, but using that power would necessarily expose the conspiracy publicly and potentially trigger a crisis within the royal family that could have long-lasting consequences for the monarchy's stability and public standing. "William, there's something else you need to know," Kate continued. "Yesterday, I was approached by a journalist named Amanda Thornfield, who claims to have additional evidence about financial irregularities connected to this surveillance operation. She's demanding an exclusive interview in exchange for sharing her information, and she's threatened to publish her story regardless of whether I cooperate." Kate pulled out copies of the documents that Thornfield had shown her during their brief meeting. Some of these financial records appeared to show payments to private investigation firms and surveillance contractors that were authorized through irregular channels. William examined the financial documents with growing incredulity. The payments documented in Thornfield's evidence showed substantial sums being transferred to companies that specialized in corporate espionage and private investigation services. The timing of these payments corresponded exactly with the period when Kate had first noticed unusual surveillance activities, and the amounts involved suggested a well-funded and professionally organized operation. "These payment authorizations are signed by Sir Geoffrey Hartwell," William observed. "This goes directly to the highest levels of the palace administration." The identification of Sir Geoffrey Hartwell as a central figure in the surveillance operation confirmed Kate and Wellington's worst suspicions about the scope and institutional support behind the conspiracy. Hartwell was not just Camilla's private secretary, but one of the most powerful and well-connected figures in the entire royal establishment. His involvement meant that the surveillance operation had been planned and executed, with full knowledge of its potential consequences for both Kate personally and the monarchy as an institution. William's phone rang, interrupting their analysis of Thornfield's evidence. The caller was Sir Edward Pemberton, the king's private secretary and one of the most senior figures in the royal household hierarchy. Pemberton's call was brief but urgent. King Charles was requesting an immediate private audience with both William and Kate at Clarence House. The timing of this summons, given everything that had been happening, suggested that news of the surveillance operation and the brewing crisis had reached the highest levels of the royal family. The drive to Clarence House gave William and Kate time to discuss how much they should reveal to King Charles and what their objectives should be for the meeting. They both understood that the king would be primarily concerned with protecting the stability and reputation of the monarchy, which might not align perfectly with their desire for justice and accountability regarding the surveillance operation. However, they also knew that Charles was fundamentally committed to the principles of fairness and integrity that had guided his approach to royal duties throughout his life. King Charles received them in his private study, a room lined with books on architecture, environmental conservation, and constitutional history that reflected his longtime interests and intellectual pursuits. His expression was grave as they entered, and Kate immediately sensed that he had already been briefed on at least some aspects of the situation they were facing. The presence of Sir Edward Pemberton in the room indicated that this was being treated as a formal matter of state rather than a family discussion. "William Catherine," the king began, using Kate's formal name in a way that emphasized the official nature of the meeting. "I have received some very troubling reports about surveillance activities and security irregularities that appear to involve members of our household staff." He gestured for them to take seats across from his desk. "I need to understand exactly what has been happening and what evidence exists to support the allegations that have been brought to my attention." William took the lead in explaining the situation, presenting the evidence in a systematic way that emphasized both the illegal nature of the surveillance and the potential damage it could cause to the monarchy if not addressed properly. He described Wellington's refusal to implement the unauthorized surveillance, Elena's documentation of the sophisticated monitoring equipment, and the pattern of media leaks that appeared to be designed to damage Kate's reputation. With each piece of evidence he presented, the king's expression grew more troubled and his questions more pointed. "These are extremely serious allegations," King Charles said when William had finished his presentation. "If accurate, they suggest a level of betrayal and abuse of power that goes to the very heart of how this institution operates." He turned to Kate directly. "Catherine, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe that this surveillance operation was specifically authorized and directed by the Queen Consort?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Kate understood that her answer would determine how the situation would be resolved. Accusing Camilla directly would trigger a constitutional crisis that could tear the royal family apart, but avoiding the truth would allow the surveillance and character assassination to continue unchecked. "Your Majesty, the authorization papers that Detective Chief Inspector Wellington showed me were signed by the Queen Consort," Kate replied carefully. "However, the scope and sophistication of the operation suggests that it involved multiple people and significant institutional resources beyond what any single individual could have arranged independently." King Charles absorbed Kate's diplomatic but pointed response with the gravity it deserved. He understood that she was providing him with enough information to understand the situation while avoiding accusations that would make quiet resolution impossible. "Sir Edward," he said, turning to his private secretary, "I want a complete and immediate investigation into these allegations. Every financial record, every equipment authorization, and every personnel decision related to royal security over the past 6 months needs to be reviewed by independent auditors." His voice carried the unmistakable authority of a monarch who was prepared to use his full power to address the crisis. The meeting continued for another hour as King Charles, William, and Kate discussed the various options for addressing the surveillance operation and its consequences. They considered everything from quiet internal disciplinary action to public exposure and criminal prosecution, weighing the potential benefits and risks of each approach. The complexity of the situation was compounded by the involvement of media figures like Amanda Thornfield, whose publication plans could force their hand regardless of what they decided privately. King Charles ultimately decided on a two-pronged approach that would address both the immediate threat to Kate and the longer-term institutional integrity issues raised by the surveillance operation. First, he would order the immediate termination of all unauthorized surveillance activities and the removal of any personnel involved in the operation. Second, he would establish an independent commission to investigate the full scope of the surveillance program and make recommendations for preventing similar abuses in the future. This approach was designed to demonstrate decisive action while maintaining the dignity and stability of the monarchy. "Catherine," King Charles said as the meeting drew to a close, "I want to personally apologize to you for what you have endured during this ordeal. The surveillance activities you have described represent a fundamental violation of the trust and privacy that every member of this family should be able to expect." His words carried both genuine remorse and a clear commitment to ensuring that such violations would not be repeated in the future. I also want to assure you that you have my complete support in whatever actions are necessary to restore your security and your confidence in the institution we all serve. The support and validation from King Charles provided Kate with the protection and authority she needed to finally feel secure in her position, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the crisis that would test the resilience and adaptability of the entire royal institution. The investigation that Charles had ordered would necessarily expose uncomfortable truths about how power had been abused within the royal household, and the public response to those revelations would determine whether the monarchy could maintain its credibility and public support in the face of such serious internal failures. As William and Kate prepared to leave Clarence House, they both understood that the most difficult challenges still lay ahead. Amanda Thornfield's story would be published regardless of the king's investigation, and the public reaction to the surveillance scandal would test the monarchy's ability to maintain its reputation for integrity and trustworthiness. The institutional reforms that King Charles had promised would take time to implement, and the people responsible for the surveillance operation would likely resist accountability efforts with all the resources at their disposal. The drive back to Kensington Palace was subdued as William and Kate processed the implications of their meeting with King Charles. They had achieved their primary objective of gaining royal support for ending the surveillance and investigating its origins, but they both understood that the personal and political costs of the crisis would continue to affect their lives and their work for months or even years to come. The conspiracy against Kate had been exposed and defeated, but the task of rebuilding trust and ensuring that such abuses could never happen again would require sustained effort and vigilance from everyone committed to the monarchy's continued evolution and improvement. The final confrontation came sooner than anyone had anticipated, when Amanda Thornfield published her explosive investigation 3 days after King Charles had ordered the internal review of the surveillance operation. Her article, which appeared simultaneously in multiple international publications, detailed not only the unauthorized monitoring of Princess Kate, but also a broader pattern of corruption and abuse of power within the royal household that extended far beyond what Kate and Wellington had initially suspected. The story included financial records, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence that painted a damning picture of institutional dysfunction at the highest levels of the monarchy. Thornfield's investigation revealed that the surveillance operation against Kate had been just one component of a larger scheme designed to consolidate power within the royal household by eliminating potential threats to certain individuals' influence and authority. The financial records she had obtained showed payments not only for surveillance equipment and private investigation services, but also for media manipulation campaigns and even bribes to palace staff members who had provided information about Kate's activities. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving dozens of people and hundreds of thousands of pounds in misappropriated funds. The public reaction to Thornfield's revelations was immediate and intense. Within hours of the story's publication, crowds of protesters had gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, demanding accountability and transparency from the royal family. The hashtag #RoyalCorruption began trending on social media platforms worldwide, and emergency sessions were called in Parliament to discuss the constitutional implications of the surveillance scandal. The monarchy faced its most serious credibility crisis in decades, with public trust in the institution plummeting to historically low levels. Detective Chief Inspector Wellington, whose suspension had been quietly lifted following King Charles's intervention, found himself at the center of the media storm, as one of the few figures in the story who had consistently acted with integrity and principle. News organizations competed to interview the officer who had risked his career to protect Princess Kate from unauthorized surveillance, and his decision to refuse improper orders was being hailed as an example of the kind of courage and moral clarity that the monarchy desperately needed to restore public confidence. The most damaging aspect of Thornfield's investigation was its revelation that Queen Consort Camilla had not only authorized the surveillance against Kate, but had done so as part of a broader effort to undermine Kate's influence within the royal family and potentially force her out of her role entirely. The evidence included recorded conversations in which Camilla discussed strategies for making Kate's position untenable, and expressed concerns about Kate's growing popularity threatening her own authority within the family hierarchy. These revelations struck at the heart of public expectations about royal family unity and mutual support. King Charles was forced to make the most difficult decision of his reign when presented with irrefutable evidence of his wife's central role in the surveillance conspiracy. The independent investigation he had ordered had moved swiftly, once Thornfield's article provided a roadmap for understanding the scope of the corruption, and the findings had confirmed every allegation made in the journalist's exposé. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell had already resigned in disgrace, but the evidence against Camilla required a response that would demonstrate the monarchy's commitment to accountability, even when it involved the king's own family members. The announcement came in a brief but unprecedented statement from Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty the Queen Consort has submitted her resignation from all royal duties and public engagements, effective immediately. This decision reflects her acknowledgement of serious errors in judgment regarding security protocols and her commitment to allowing the institution to move forward with integrity and public confidence. The carefully worded statement avoided explicit admission of wrongdoing while making it clear that Camilla's departure was a consequence of the surveillance scandal. Princess Kate's response to the crisis demonstrated the grace under pressure that had made her one of the most respected members of the royal family, even before the surveillance scandal had elevated her to the status of a sympathetic victim. In her first public statement since Thornfield's article was published, Kate emphasized her commitment to the monarchy as an institution, while acknowledging the pain caused by the betrayal of trust she had experienced. Her words struck exactly the right tone of forgiveness without acceptance of abuse, and strength without vindictiveness. "The past several months have been challenging for me personally and for my family," Kate said in her carefully prepared statement. "However, I want to emphasize that my faith in the institution of the monarchy remains unshaken. The actions of a few individuals do not define the character or values of the royal family as a whole." She paused, her composure evident despite the emotional difficulty of the situation. "I am grateful for the support I have received from His Majesty the King, from my husband, and from the many dedicated staff members who serve this institution with integrity and honor." Wellington's reinstatement as Kate's primary protection officer was announced as part of a broader reorganization of royal security protocols designed to prevent future abuses of surveillance authority. The new protocols included independent oversight of all surveillance activities, mandatory reporting of security decisions to multiple levels of authority, and clear protections for staff members who reported concerns about improper orders or activities. Wellington was also promoted to Chief of Royal Protection, recognition of both his integrity during the crisis and the need for leadership committed to ethical principles rather than political loyalty. The investigation into the surveillance conspiracy continued for several more months, ultimately resulting in criminal charges against 6 individuals, including Sir Geoffrey Hartwell and several private contractors who had installed unauthorized monitoring equipment. The financial irregularities exposed by Thornfield's investigation led to the recovery of hundreds of thousands of pounds in misappropriated funds and the implementation of new financial oversight procedures, designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The scandal had been expensive and embarrassing for the monarchy, but the thoroughness of the response helped rebuild public confidence over time. Elena Rodriguez, the telecommunications technician whose documentation had been crucial to exposing the surveillance operation, was awarded the Order of the British Empire for her courage in coming forward with evidence of wrongdoing. Her testimony during the criminal proceedings provided detailed technical evidence that corroborated the broader pattern of surveillance abuse documented by Wellington and Thornfield. Elena's recognition sent a clear message that the monarchy valued integrity and courage over institutional loyalty when the two came into conflict. The long-term consequences of the surveillance scandal extended far beyond the immediate personnel changes and criminal prosecutions. The crisis had forced the royal family to confront fundamental questions about power, accountability, and transparency within the institution, leading to the most comprehensive reforms of royal administration in over a century. New oversight bodies were established to monitor financial decisions and security protocols, and regular independent audits were instituted to ensure compliance with ethical standards and legal requirements. Prince William's role during the crisis had demonstrated his commitment to protecting both his family and the integrity of the monarchy, positioning him as a future king who would prioritize justice and accountability over institutional convenience. His unwavering support for Kate throughout the ordeal had not only strengthened their marriage but had also enhanced his public reputation as a leader who would defend principle over politics when faced with difficult choices. The experience had prepared him for the complex challenges he would face as a future monarch in an era of increasing scrutiny and accountability. The media landscape surrounding the royal family also evolved significantly in the aftermath of the surveillance scandal. Thornfield's investigation had demonstrated the value of serious investigative journalism in holding powerful institutions accountable, but it had also highlighted the need for responsible reporting that distinguished between legitimate public interest and invasive sensationalism. New guidelines were developed for royal coverage that balanced transparency requirements with appropriate privacy protections for family members. Kate's emergence from the crisis as a stronger and more confident royal figure reflected both her personal resilience and the institutional support she had ultimately received once the truth was exposed. The surveillance operation had been designed to undermine her confidence and force her into a more submissive role within the royal hierarchy. But its exposure had actually enhanced her authority and public standing. She had proven that she could withstand intense pressure while maintaining her dignity and commitment to service, qualities that would serve her well as a future queen. Wellington's role in exposing the surveillance conspiracy had transformed him from a dutiful protection officer into a symbol of the kind of moral courage that the monarchy needed to maintain public trust and confidence. His willingness to risk his career to protect Kate from unauthorized surveillance had demonstrated that the institution could still produce individuals committed to principle over convenience, providing hope that future abuses could be prevented through the integrity of those sworn to protect royal family members. The final resolution of the surveillance scandal came nearly a year after Wellington had first refused to implement Camilla's unauthorized surveillance orders. The last of the criminal trials had concluded, the institutional reforms had been implemented, and public confidence in the monarchy had begun to recover from the damage caused by the conspiracy. King Charles marked the anniversary with a personal letter to Wellington, thanking him for his service and his courage in protecting both his daughter-in-law and the integrity of the institution they all served. As the royal family moved forward from the crisis, the lessons learned from the surveillance scandal continued to shape how the monarchy operated and how it understood its responsibilities to both its members and the public. The institution had survived one of its most serious internal challenges by ultimately choosing accountability over cover-up, reform over status quo, and justice over institutional convenience. The monarchy that emerged from the scandal was smaller, more transparent, and more committed to the ethical principles that justified its continued existence in a democratic society. The story of the surveillance scandal and its resolution became a defining moment in the modern history of the British monarchy, demonstrating both the institution's vulnerability to abuse and corruption and its capacity for self-correction when faced with undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. Kate and Wellington's courage in resisting the unauthorized surveillance had not only protected Kate's privacy and dignity, but had also preserved the monarchy's ability to maintain public trust through demonstrated commitment to justice and accountability. The crisis had tested the institution's fundamental values and found them strong enough to survive even the most serious internal betrayals when defended by individuals of principle and courage.